Welcome everyone again to our third installment for the week for our Leaders Online series, our virtual learning series, where we're trying to get as much information out to you as possible on the different resources and ideas and best practices that are out there. Really excited about today, talking about rediscovering your why. Looking at your business, what does that mean? How are you auditing? How are you looking forward to the next step in the evolution of your company during this difficult time? So want to introduce Sean Woolley. He's the Executive Director and DFW Market Lead for Jabian Consultant, and Greg Giesecke, right? He's also Executive Director for Jabian, and Ryan Nichols, who's also a manager with Jabian Consulting. So with that, I will turn it over to them. They have some information we're going to share. And so as always, as we are going through the presentation, please feel free to put your questions, comments, and thoughts in the Q&A, and we will get to those as we go. So with that, Sean, I'll turn it over to you to introduce ourselves.
Great. Chris, thank you very much. We very much appreciate the opportunity and the invitation from the Chamber to speak to you all today. And as Chris said, what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about, really zeroing in on your company's purpose, why you exist. And we believe it's important to do that in times such as this. And then, thinking about that purpose within the context of all the suppliers and customers and intermediaries that you interact with to, again, to deliver valuable products and services to your clients. So let's jump forward, Greg. So again, I'm Sean Woolley. I'm the lead for our management consulting offerings and practice here in DFW. I've been doing this for 25 plus years, really helping companies transform their business, often in the best of times and sometimes in the worst of times, which certainly is where we are today. So I'm delighted to be here. I'll give Greg a moment to introduce himself, and then we can dive in on the topic.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Greg Giesecke. Similar to Sean, I'm a career consultant. Been doing this for a majority of my career now. I'm really focused on large and mid-sized companies, thinking through areas of opportunity, problems that they need support addressing, or really working through kind of areas of turmoil like we're in right now. I think one thing we find is that in all scenarios, there is opportunity and there is crisis that's happening. So being able to take a pragmatic step back and look at that is something that firms like ourselves are kind of adept at helping folks do.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So a little bit of context here. Before I dive in on this, though, I definitely would encourage you to use the functionality that we've got here on the technology platform. If you've got questions or comments, fire those in. We'd like to certainly make this interactive. We know we're all getting a lot of information, and we find that we can emphasize or de-emphasize some of this based on the questions that we see. So feel free. So before we dive in, a couple of really important context setting things. This is absolutely unprecedented, I think, in modern history, as I'm sure everyone can appreciate. And with the global economy being more interconnected than it has ever been, really in human history, something like this really creates vast impacts. We expect there will be some level of a sustained period of challenges for at least some companies and some people around the planet. And it's also important to know that there's a lot that remains to be learned. Data continues to come in. I'm sure all of us are watching the infection rates and the 24-hour news cycle, and information is constantly changing. And lastly, there's really no crystal clear time frame for when things are going to be resolved in terms of vaccines or other things and various different testing. And we don't really know when or if we're going to return to business as usual. So what we want to talk with you guys today, again, as leaders and members of the DFW business community, how do you conduct your business, grow your business, maybe even make some decisions to shrink your business so that you can grow later, again, in these uncertain times. So we're going to take you through a framework and a real practical approach that'll help you, gain some additional perspective. And we'd like to kind of say, open your aperture and your thinking, so you can contemplate where you sit. And we use this concept of the value chain, and that is really, where you sit relative to, again, all of your suppliers, your customers, customers, and then various different intermediaries in that that whole ecosystem. And we find, since basically everyone is being affected by this. So if you operate as a member of a business or a business leader with a mindset towards not just your own company's perspective, but what others are going through, as you think of different scenarios, contemplate action plans to go take. Our recommendations are that you'll find that you'll come up with better plans, and you're more likely going to get on the other side of this as a healthy business, and make more meaningful impacts in the community. Couple more important data points. We did a little digging before we jumped in today, and started to look at comparisons of this coronavirus crisis to financial downturns in the 80s, the 90s, 2000, late 2008, 2009 financial crisis. And one study found that of about 5,000 public companies, a full set, approximately 20% of those companies didn't fare well. So 1,000 of those companies either went bankrupt, they weren't able to be continuously traded publicly, or they were acquired by a competitor or some other company. So that's the bad news. A couple of other important data points, though. Our elected officials have already poured $500 billion more in economic stimulus as compared to all of the stimulus that was put forth in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. So we're seeing, fortunately, a great deal of, support, again, from our elected officials, much more so than in past times, and I that certainly is helping. And the other nice thing is this is very much directed at the broader economy, not any single sector of the economy, which is necessary here. And then lastly, we're only on part way through, I think, that stimulus. I think there's, as you guys were saying, especially small business owners on the call today, we're already seeing the need to shore up and increase investment in stimulus there. And the last point here is, it's not all doom and gloom for those companies who, have the right balance of, defensive tactics and offensive tactics across their business. And we think operating, again, with an eye towards your overarching ecosystem, you see 10% of companies, ultimately thrive. So, we expect that, 68% of companies are going to get through this, and, more than a handful, that 10% are going to thrive on the other side of this if you can find the time and the ability to think ahead a little bit. So before we dive in on the again our framework and approach we're going to talk to today, something that we find helpful in times as unprecedented as these is anchoring back to your company's core purpose or your why. Example of that, might be a statement from a healthcare company. One of those that we came across, the purpose statement for that company is to preserve and improve human life. So if when you think about why does your company really exist, if you've got a statement such as that is clear for you, the leadership team, your employees, your stakeholders, what that does is it informs how you operate. So the processes and tools and IT systems and all those different things, and governance and metrics, it informs all of that, and then it ultimately helps you, really zero in on what the end product and services you ultimately deliver to your customers. Companies that have a core purpose statement that's clear and understood, we find that they develop and provide more valuable, more compelling products and services. So, we want you to have that in mind as we go into, again, a little bit more of a practical framework, and again, a practical approach that you can use as you contemplate your business, making decisions that, some that you may have already made, some that you're going to make, and we think about doing those again within a broader value chain, and contemplating different scenarios for how this is going to play out and the actions and strategies you can put in place.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think we feel, because of the pace that this crisis has really impacted all of the organizations, the economy as a whole, really, the global economy, is that people have SWAT teams focused on the what. There is a lot of conversations around, what do I need to do today, tonight, and tomorrow morning in order to keep the lights on, to fight the fires, to do what's really needed. And I think for a while now, that has been the right primary focus for most organizations. I think, staying tactically focused, thinking about the goals that you have right ahead of you, is the real focus. But what that kind of does is, for a temporary period of time, it puts you on the inverse, right? You're thinking about the what, and during this incredibly rapid period of transition, typically you don't readdress your why, your function in the market, or even fundamentally how you support your customers very often. This is not something that happens very frequently. But during the rapid pace of crisis that we see now, that's one of the kind of points that we want to emphasize, is that it's important to readdress those in times of crisis. There are, an uncountable number of terrible things that are happening as a result of this, but also, there's really important to consider that there is opportunity to be taken, and that's where that kind of 9% on that previous view showed. Companies can fare well during this time, taking market share, making conservative investments, taking advantage of the thoughtful business approach you've made for the past years. So two things that we want to talk through today are really a frame and an approach. But before we get that, I just want to root in a couple of ideas of what is this concept. Value chain makes you think about supply chain or value chain analysis. There's some Lean Six Sigma ideas that roll around this. But what we really mean by value chain is an illustrative view of how products and services get down to create the value for your customers and your ultimate consumers. So this is really an attempt to map what we say here, a complex flow of information, goods and services, and ultimately the value. And the complex nature of that is something that's really important. I think something that we see very often with the nature of this crisis is a natural tendency to look inward. Most folks think introspectively. You kind of feel what's happening to you, and you're going to take a reaction activity against that. But we do feel that it's very important to consider upstream and downstream partners' perspective. I think some folks on this call, company leaders across the DFW Metroplex, we've had an opportunity to work with over the past couple of weeks, and we've learned a lot from them. And we're really seeing this idea of those that are thinking about this well, think about their trading partners' perspectives, what is happening to their customers, not just my revenue is down, so this must be hard for my customer. Thinking about that broader perspective, it really creates an opportunity for leadership. I think that's a chance that you have to take within this time. And then the other idea is there are many dramatic events. Every Thursday morning, I've been sending out a note to my team to talk about what happened to the unemployment records that come out. It's wild. It's multiples of the all-time records. It's a pretty crazy thing to see, but it's also really important to ask yourself, so what? What does that mean? What does that do? There's a compassionate point of view that we all take as humans, and then there's a really pragmatic view that we need to take as people. And I think what we need to do for that is react, plan, and replan. All three of those ideas are things that you need to keep in your head, I think, as we go through these times, because again, we see a lot of folks that have a tendency to react. I think there's a lot of ad hoc conversations that prove to be very valuable, but something that we're going to talk about today is how do you set up a process for that? So any single great event that you had that was a really good conversation that helped you think through, helped you brainstorm, a good connection with a trading partner you've worked with, how do you industrialize that? How do you get that to happen, every day, every week, every month, instead of letting that happen react? So kind of taking a process approach is something we want to introduce here too. So I think a couple of terms that have a tendency to get confused. We'll talk through two kind of structures. We think about these as there's a framework. So this is really an outline of an idea that we would take. So, what we call this is the value stream that we're thinking about, which is the framework to work through. Then we'll also talk about the approach. So obviously today is a bit more of an academic conversation. I think there's, every industry within the economy represented on this call today. And how you interpret this relatively academic idea is going to be very different. But we're going to try to take this framework and approach and apply it to a theoretical example. We've kind of made up a company that we've had some brainstorm time around to really kind of put this true. And something that you'll hopefully hear us talk back to a few times is action. I think it's all too easy to have really interesting intellectual conversations about what we're experiencing right now, and not put as much of a focus on the action that you need to take. So what? What do I do with this information, and what is my team going to really execute? So before I dive in, I just want to reiterate Sean's point. I think there is a really good opportunity for conversation here. Please feel free to, text in any questions that you have. Sean and Ryan are both watching those question chains and are going to bring that up and try to make this a little bit more conversational if it lends itself to that. So the basic concept, and I think if you take away nothing from what we say today, this is the slide. So if you're multitasking, now's the time to pop open the screen and take a look. I think if you look at the center of the slide right now, this is where we believe most organizations look. We hear folks talk first, second, and third, not because they're selfish, but because that's their area of responsibility to think about your own organization. I'm feeling these impacts all the time. You have a better perspective on those. It's just a more natural conversation that you have. Frankly, it's your fiduciary responsibility to do that. So, everybody's thinking about their organizations, but we find that there's a lot of value to first think about your organizational impact. What are you feeling? And then take a big step back and think about what that means from other trading partners within your channel. So that, think about on this chain, if you take a step back and look right, you're going to see your customers, the folks that you interact with daily. Many folks on this call, I'm sure, have a very complex set of supply chain before your value gets to a consumer. So your customers, your customers, and those downstream, to take a step back and really understand why the revenue stream is changing. Why did the product mix shift so dramatically? You're going to be constantly dealing with lagging indicators if you're only looking inward. And I think it's only by taking these outside steps that you're really able to understand a broader perspective and really start to develop some of those leading indicators that will help you get through that. On the left side of your value chain is most surely a very complex set of suppliers. Raw materials inputs, distributors, redistributors, your manufacturing customers. You've got a lot of suppliers upstream that you rely on in order to be able to kind of take your unique place in the industry. For large macro organizations, this is many companies. For some organizations, this is one tier that you really work with. But I think at the bottom of the slide, we try to call out this idea of intermediaries. I think there's been a lot of marketing campaign against the middleman, but we know a lot of organizations that really rely on intermediaries for knowledge exchange, education of themselves and their customer base. Functionality like we're doing today to get broadened perspectives. I think those intermediaries play a lot of roles within the value chain, and it's really important to understand those perspectives as well. Just to give some context to what we mean by those, I'm by no means going to drain all of these, but this is really some considerations that we would take as you think through your organizations and up and downstream. Again, this is an academic approach that hopefully resonates somewhat with everyone, but it by no means is the answer for everyone. So whether you're a restaurant, a large chain, a distribution company, or a high technology company, you think about your suppliers and customers market as a very different view. But what we really want to make sure we anchor back on is the cost basis that you support, the revenue that you drive, all is driven by how you create value within the economy. That anchors back to the why. It's not just a fuzzy feel-good statement that you make. It's an important thing to really anchor on right now. One of the conversations that I think we heard in the past weeks was kind of, is it insensitive to promote, market, sell my company during times like these? And I think that's a very compassionate way to think about it. But it's also not it's kind of doing yourself a disservice. Whatever role you play in the economy, you are adding value to your customers. They don't have to buy from you. They need to, and they want to buy from you. And making sure you understand what's your role that you play, how do you close that gap. You really owe it to your customer base to help them identify what's needed and do all that you can to make sure that changes to your current approach, shifts in how you provide value, what you believe are going to be recovery scenarios. I think there's a real kind of obligation that we have to make sure we're still doing that for our customers and our suppliers. So that's kind of the framework to think through. So a little bit of a mindset to think about, not just yourself. And then this is the approach that we are proposing. So this is an activity that I think could be done in, an hour brainstorm session with a team, or this could be a dedicated 4 weeks of a team to put together a core process in. But a couple of the ideas that we want to make sure are clear is this concept of, in the middle of the screen, you can see a line that denotes today. So that's really just meaning time frame relative. The two things on the left are looking back. I need to make sure that I'm constantly thinking about, we call these events and impacts. It doesn't really matter how you think of them, but there's two distinct concepts that we want to show here. One is the forces that you feel, the events that are happening in the market. Some of these matter, some of these don't. Some of these are interesting, some of these will go unnoticed. But these are things that are happening throughout. Those events, it's important to observe, keep your mind open, your head up, and really organize those. Those events are going to be single individual nouns that run throughout your brain. It's really important to synthesize those. We kind of refer to an affinity exercise. What things go together and what do I need to grab a hold of to really make sense out of something? So that's what we talk about impacts. It's not important what the words, whether you call them these, but think about a collection of events driving an impact to me. I now need to prove or disprove that impact. I need to understand how important it is for me to understand. And I need to think about what's going to happen in the future. So that's where we shift across this line from today to tomorrow, and we start to think about scenarios. Something that's really interesting when we talk about this scenario-based concept with folks is you are not trying to get it right. You are not trying to predict the date that we're going to reopen the economy. We're not trying to pick the date that your revenue is going to get back to 100.0 of what it was before. Frankly, that doesn't really matter. What matters is the actions that you're going to take based on those scenarios. So something that's really useful is even to paint ends of the spectrum scenarios that are by no means reasonable. They are never going to happen. They're extremes to prove a point. But even if that extreme case was true, what would you do? So those are the two important back and forth points. To paint some scenarios, really understand some level of likelihood and say, this is a theoretical exercise that will not happen. This is a likely case that we should be ready for. But every single time when you think through the 2 or 100 scenarios that your business needs to really contemplate, the most important thing to address is what actions you're going to take against that. It's really interesting to think, what is going to happen to our economy? When are we going to rebound? Is there going to be a refall? What's this virus really going to mean for the new normal or our V-shaped recovery? It's interesting to talk about that, but what's the obligation that we have is to discuss the actions that we would take in either scenario. So this is the general approach that we kind of propose. Again, this is something that means something very different to many different organizations, but thinking about a periodic process that you would take to watch events, collect, synthesize, and analyze some impacts, and then every once in a while, consider what do those things mean, and then really get your team focused on action. I think water cooler talk is probably taking over a decent portion of our day when we think about what happened in the news and what's going to happen next. But leaders like yourselves really need to make sure we're talking about what's next. All right, so we have taken a bit of a theoretical approach to trying to make some of this seem real. So, we talked a lot about the frame and the approach, and those are both represented on this slide here. And we've made up a company. So this company is a cardboard manufacturer that sells into a variety of industries. They've got a diversified portfolio, but one of the industries that they manufacture for is the food industry. So that food industry includes a great big cardboard box to ship a side of beef, and it includes a to-go container that you pick up from your local restaurant tonight. That's kind of the frame of the theoretical company we've built here. And on the left, we've tried to highlight across this value chain from top to bottom, what are some examples of impacts that we see? So we think about it from a supplier's perspective. A major impact is that inbound supply lines from international ports are already constrained. Many have been shut down. Chinese ports have been reopened. There's a lot of events that happened, but the concern we see is that U.S. supply is easier to move around. International supply is much more difficult to move around. That's something that I feel. I think that it's important to me, but I don't really know what to do about it. So that's an impact that you document, you write down, and you manage. Another thing you're seeing within your organization as a cardboard manufacturer is a dramatic shift in my portfolio demand. I used to have a really stable order balance of these 75 SKUs of this relative percentage mix. Seasonally, it goes up and down, but my general mix is the same. Volatility for the past 6 months has been stable. Volatility for the past 10 years has been predictable. This is something that I think, resonates with a lot of folks who think it would never change more than this. And that, X number that you stated has been, potentially impacted by 10X. I think, you can think about this organization the same way, where they feel that their product mix is shifting. But, it's really important for them to take a big step back. And I think the important side to see here is what is customer and consumer demand that's driving that. So customer demand channels have dramatically shifted. The way that I buy my lettuce is basically the same the way I bought my lettuce, but the way lettuce is consumed is dramatically higher balance towards in-home consumption. I now no longer buy from my in-office deli. My children don't eat within the school systems, and I'm not buying nearly as much as I used to from restaurants. So all of those channels where this cardboard company would sell the lettuce manufacturer a great big box, now they need to sell much smaller individual components of that. So their packaging shifts has shifted, their product demand has moved, and knowing that that is driven by my consumers' consumption shifts is something that I need to understand. Now we think about, what am I going to do about that? If we think we have an idea based on our political bent, our ideological approach, everybody loves to say, here's what I think is going to happen. But what you think is going to happen, frankly, doesn't matter. We need to think about what are the limits of the spectrum that are going to drive very different sets of action. So in this example, a very quick rebound means you're not changing big negotiations with suppliers. You're not having dramatically different conversations with customers. Your customers are going to get back, consumers' demands are going to shift back in the next couple of months. Your consumer mix could come back roughly the way that it was before. Institutional demand is going to return. Institutions like restaurants, prisons, they're going to buy from you like they have. Your big customers are going to buy things in a similar way. So you're going to renegotiate some things on a short-term basis. However, there's a midterm way that says that takes a longer time to come back. It takes 6 months. We're going to have a problem come back in the fall, and this is going to be an extended rebound where consumer sentiment is driven the 3 steps of the supply chain before it really gets towards this manufacturer's point of view. But understanding that consumer's point of view is there, and I think that takes some opportunity to establish a point of view for your downstream trading partners, help them lead for what this short-term but significant shift is going to be, and renegotiate some of your upstream work. And then the other big idea that we talk about in the news a lot is this concept of a new normal. There's an idea that says at an extreme, again, I don't think most folks think this will really happen, but if we say we never go back to an office, we all work from home for forever, every kid in the US is homeschooled for the rest of their lives. What does that mean? What actions should this manufacturing company do? It freaks you out on a personal side, but you put that to bed, and then you focus on what does that mean for your product mix. It means you need to partner with your customers' industry groups to really rethink this. It means you have a different role of vertical integration. Your customers are going to play a different role in the industry, and you can support that in a different way. Your suppliers are going to play a different role, and you're going to have a different world to manage on that. And I also think, in that new normal, you're going to take a fundamental shift, not to scale back, but to fundamentally realign my sales and service organizations to shift towards that new normal. And again, these are boundaries on a spectrum, so you pull these into whatever you think is realistic. But if I compare a theoretical extreme, and that same action I take is to what I think would happen on the right side of my realistic spectrum, then that's an area where you think you may not be missing something. So I'll pause there. Maybe Sean or Ryan, did we have any questions that come in or any kind of conversations that we want to point to within this?
Yeah, a couple, Greg. Thanks for walking through all of that. Before I dive on one of the questions, one thing that I think is important to note here is the value of the scenario concept, which is, it's that point you said, Greg, you can't predict the future. No one can. If we could, then, well, I don't know, we'd all be billionaires. So in the scenario concept, it's laying these out somewhat realistic, and then as events unfold, you've already thought about different strategies and actions to pivot and shift to, depending on how things evolve in the next 1, 3, 5, 10, 6 months, right? So that's a very valuable thing to do in applying this framework. So one of the questions we got, Greg, was have we seen any companies doing this already, either starting to or seeing success with it? And again, what's working, what's not? Are there pitfalls to watch out for, or things to anchor on more or less? Yeah,
we've seen. I mean, we see most companies thinking through some aspect of this. I'd say especially that scenario play view, where a lot of people are just kind of working through a what if scenario. If this happens, what do I do? So I think a lot of customers are doing that. The shift that we see, something that we see that's really effective, is breaking some mind share between the folks that are thinking tactically about the here and now. What are we doing in the next 2 weeks, 2 weeks to a month, and then a separate team who's really focused on that longer term. And both of those have implications of this concept. If you think about what needs to happen in the next month for your industry or your function, there are scenarios, there are implications on suppliers, customers, and yourself that you need to think through, and there's options for what those would happen on a short-term basis. And then if you think about, let's think about a 5-year horizon. If you have a separate team thinking about that, I'm sure people on your team that can think about, lend themselves towards one type of a concept and another. It's still the same framework, it's still the same approach, it's still the same scenario analysis. You just put a very different time frame on that. So lots of different companies are doing it. Something else we see is, companies are obviously impacted by this in dramatically different ways. Some companies have already seen the bottom and are recovering from that. Other companies believe that this continued turmoil is really what's going to drive them towards the bottom. So even if GDP recovers, that's not really what's going to drive them. It's really consumer sentiment that's going to help. And then other folks are, this is a ripe opportunity. We kind of shy away from saying the word take advantage of, but this is an opportunity to capitalize on. Their demand is up, their revenue shift is in their favor. It still creates challenges, very difficult things to work through that scenarios need to be managed in, but it's equally as important. If your revenue's up and there's going to be a quick rebound, a quick shift back to normal, you're not making significant capital investments. If this is the new normal where your demand is going to dramatically grow, you have an opportunity for a plateau step function. How do you take that big step up with the market demand? And those are scenarios that you need to plan through as well.
Great. I think another question that we're seeing is, are you seeing differences in business to business analysis of this kind of stuff, or business to customer directs? Is there a way to think about this approach differently depending on what my business is?
Yeah, I would say this is incrementally more of a focus for companies that operate in a complex B2B environment. If you think of yourself as a direct business to consumer with a fairly simple set of suppliers, then this is an interesting exercise, but it may not glean that many insights. But even still, I think it's important to think through, what is that kind of vertical integration across this view here, top to bottom? What is your role and how would that change? But a significant view that we see, and really most companies in the economy have a pretty complex engagement with their consumer base, even if it seems like from news headlines it could be simple. Most companies, like those on this call, have a pretty complex relationship with suppliers and downstream consumers, where we talked to a set of leaders this morning that were talking about the number of companies that they deal with who are simultaneously their suppliers, their own vertical competitors, and their customers. So, big macro organizations that deal with this in many different ways, those companies want to partner as much as, the information that you guys need, they also need that. So I think in that B2B complex environment, it helps. But these are learnings that we see from a more complex set that are very beneficial to, someone that would think of themselves as a little bit more of a simple kind of operating model. Thinking about your suppliers and their impacts really allows you to take a leadership state and not feel so driven and kind of whipped around by what's happening, but really kind of get your hand more on the wheel and take a leadership role.
Great. And something I'd add there too is, if you are a B2C business to direct to consumer kind of business, or simple or less complex business, this is still something worth doing. It's just a matter of how much time do you invest in it, and how broadly do you think of that as an individual entrepreneur, or running a smaller business, or pulling your some subset or your entire management team through this. These things can be done fairly quickly, and even in those situations, I think you might uncover some insights at a minimum, you'll find a better way to again be a more impactful player in the local economy here.
Yep.
Another thing I'd add, that companies that are taking an innovative approach on this is trying to do this somewhat transparently with your trading partners. So imagine a world where you get on a phone call or a setting such as this with your three most important customers and your five most important suppliers, and have this open conversation about, well, what do you independently think are some of the scenarios that might play out. And you got to tread carefully there in terms of how you approach that. You probably want to do that with trusted relationships, but that is one innovative approach that we're seeing some companies take.
Yep.
And
Great.
Sean,
Well, just kind of to summarize.
or Greg, I did see a question come from the gallery. So we mentioned earlier that 9% of the companies have thrived after previous recessions by taking market share and being conservative with their investments. How would you go about evaluating investments at the moment, not knowing how the scenarios are going to play out? For example, how do you evaluate a potential acquisition, not knowing if you're headed for the new normal scenario?
Yeah. I think this is, again, we kind of get back to the scenario what if analysis. There is of course, in any situation when you consider an investment like that, you think through kind of that pro forma. What would my new world look like if we bought this company? What's our top line change in cost? Where do we see synergies? What's our new bottom line impact from that? The challenge here is you're not going to rely on one model. I think something we see often is that companies really have to manage this scenario play, this scenario balance, to build bookend spectrums and then see when does the decision shift. So I don't know what the answer is going to be. So to say, here's the expected net present value of this acquisition is probably a much more difficult exercise to do with accuracy, but it's really important to see what's that break-even point. When do we see a tip in the decision? So at some point, here to here, Now my decision isn't a net present positive value, it's a negative, and we're going to take it in another direction. Great. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah, some things I'd add there too is like, contemplate your own, cash position, equity position, debt position, depending, if if it's an acquisition kind of example, and then, how sizable of an acquisition is it for you? Is it in a market that's immediately adjacent to what you do now, or in your current market, current customers? So think like lower risk, right? And, proceed down the lower risk path until we all get some greater certainty. And I'll say that, we do work with more than a handful of private equity companies, and I think the theme, both nationally and in the DFW area, still remains. Mostly PE companies on the acquisition front are in evaluation mode, either their current portfolio and starting to look at acquisitions, but no one is leaning too far forward on acquisitions just yet.
Yep. Yeah, because typically that point where your decision shifts from go to no go, that realm isn't outside the side of possibility. It's it creates a level of uncertainty that makes that investment decision difficult right now. Great. Well, just kind of a summary to come back. I think everyone on this call, I'm sure, has had a lot of conversations about how do we establish a SWAT team, manage through this crisis, make sure we put our people, our customers at the forefront, and really focus on that what that you're delivering. I'd say, even if you completed a confident strategy, mission, vision in January, that is upside down now. So there is a why and a how conversation that I think you have an opportunity to rethink now. Hopefully the framework and approach that we've outlined today has been helpful. Again, we're a local model consulting firm. Ryan, Sean, myself, everybody within Jabian comes from a firm that travels all over the country, but that's not what we do. We're really focused here in the DFW metro, and we look to make sure we're supporting our partners in this market. So we want to make sure we end with in times of uncertainty like this, having this sense of community really matters. Whether that's a virtual community driven by an industry function, a virtual community now driven by a geographic function because we don't have a chance to meet in person. I think it's really important to think local, act local, do what you can to support your local economy, whether that's driving cash flow. If you have an opportunity to pay terms early, get ahead of invoices, that's something that can drive a dramatic change to how your trading partners will feel. Expanding those payment terms where you can to take advantage, leverage a local workforce where at all possible. I think, everybody's thinking about kind of protecting their local community. And I think, obviously the Fort Worth community is as strong as many. And then I think, leverage those relationships and drive those relationships. Hopefully, companies like ourselves are able to provide some support, and communities like the chamber here is able to really provide a safety net, a help, an educational approach. So again, we appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today, and hopefully this was helpful. If there's any questions that are unasked or unanswered, please feel free to reach out to any of us at any time. Now is the time to lean on each other and really kind of ask the hard questions and see where we can. So Sean, myself, Brittany is one of our team members that focused on the Fort Worth area as well. Please feel free to reach out and let us know what we can do.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for all that great information. That was a ton of really, really good information. I know I'll have to watch this a couple of times just to digest all of that. And Greg, I'm going to apologize to you because even though you told me how to say your name, I still screwed it up in the beginning. Giesecke.
Not the first time.
So thank you all for doing that. I did have a couple of questions come in that I know we answered, but just as an overview and a follow-up for those who joined us late. This process here, it's for any industry or any size of company, one person, startup, entrepreneur, 1,000 people, food, data center, restaurant, whatever it is, you know, everybody should be looking at doing this this process. And then the second one is there's no wrong time to start the process. I mean, obviously we're in an interesting time right now, but you know, you use this process now in 5 years and 10 years to really look at yourself and reinvent yourself. So I'm assuming that I'm correct in that statement.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Only thing I'd add is, you know, times like now just make this more important to do more frequently. You know, this is a process that lots of companies think through annually, quarterly, every couple of years. But right now it's pretty important to do pretty frequently based on how fast things are changing.
Great. Well, again, thank you, Sean, Greg, Ryan, for coming on and doing this. And to the folks who are still on, we'll be downloading this. It'll be available for you to watch again. And any questions that you might have that you think of after the fact, send them over to us, send them over to the team there, and they'll be happy to answer those questions. So moving forward, just wanted to give you a couple of highlights of what we'll be working towards here yet this week and next week. Just a reminder, we have our LinkedIn online office hours that we launched last week. We're going to be doing that again tomorrow. Starts at 10 a.m. Get on to our LinkedIn page, and the topic this week is leading and managing remotely. And so if you have questions or thoughts, we'll have a panel of experts ready to answer any questions. So we'll pose that question and feel free to have that open discussion with the folks that will be online. I also want to say, we've been doing these here the last couple of weeks from Tuesday to Thursday. But next week, we're going to go Monday through Thursday, because Monday we have a special program they're going to put on. I don't know if anybody has seen it, but the city has just launched a new business resiliency microloan program. There's a mouthful, but great program that the city has come up with to help the small business and get us through this difficult time. So we're going to have Robert Stearns, the Director of Economic Development for the city, and Erica Hirsch from the People Fund, who are partnering together on this program. So we're going to have a lot of great detail on that. So just another funding opportunity. But I wanted to get that out there today because we're not going to be live tomorrow, but you're going to get an email with this, and then also the other webinars we'll be doing next week. But again, any questions, reach out to us. We want to be a resource for you. And thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Be safe.
Thanks.